Check this out. There are so many different myths and misconceptions about martial arts and martial artists. There are so many different stories about who we are, what we do, how do we train, and what do we actually do. Well, what I'm going to try to do is expose some of these myths and correct some of these misconceptions and hopefully bring some truth and reality to the forefront. There are a lot of misconceptions about why people started to train in the martial arts, especially back in the 60s and 70s. Well, back then, for us, the reason was very simple. We needed to learn how to fight. We needed to learn how to defend ourselves. If it was the 1930s or 40s, we probably would have joined a boxing gym and learned basic fisticuffs as a means of self-defense. Well, in the 60s and 70s, you learned karate, harangdo, taekwondo, hapkido, kung fu, and so on. The training was rough, the training was hard, and sometimes it was even painful. It was also kind of painful in boxing, too. At the end of the class, your arms and legs felt like they were made out of lead weights. You could barely move or lift them. Muscles that you never knew you had were sore and aching. We would sit in stances for long periods of time. We would sit in a horse stance, which we called kimajase, horse riding stance. We would also stand in debijase, which we called a fighting stance. We also did front stance, konjukjase. We would be in those stances for long periods of time, just getting your muscles used to those positions. And then, of course, getting your mind disciplined to it, too. We would go over techniques. We would do techniques over and over and over and over again. I remember we even had some classes where we would just do one technique for the entire class. I mean, we would just do some kick-punch combination, and maybe that's all we did for the hour we were in class, or the 90 minutes we were in class, because classes also back then weren't just regulated to an hour. Some of the classes were 90 minutes. I remember even having classes that were 2-3 hours long. But through all this, you learned a different way and a different method of self-defense. Another popular misconception that I've heard by a number of people is that they believe that there was a lot of dojangs and dojos back in the 60s and 70s. Well, the truth of the matter is there were not a lot of storefront dojos. There weren't a lot of storefront schools. Mostly what you had were classes in your local YMCAs, your local recreation centers. They had classes in church basements. You had classes in the utility rooms in the projects. And also, there wasn't a lot of advertisement about these classes. You found out about them through word of mouth, or there might have been a flyer or two hanging up somewhere. Tournaments back then were also a little different. Tournaments were a place where you could try your techniques. You could try out what you learned in a relatively safe environment. Tournaments were a place where you discovered, well, if you kept getting hit, your defense wasn't working. That meant you had to go back to the Dojang and figure out what went wrong and what was what. Now, don't get me wrong. There were some relatively big tournaments. It was just rare to see a tournament that had 200 or 300 or more competitors. There were a couple, but those were few and far between. In the mid-1980s or so, you started to see a lot more of those larger tournaments. In fact, you also started to see the uprise of these tournament circuits. Some of them were even national circuits. But again, if you could fight in a tournament, you're relatively assured that you could pretty much fight in the street. Because tournament or point fighting wasn't this game of tag that point fighting has suddenly de-evolved into.